In this problem, we're going to be an aspiring investor. We're going to analyze the returns of two separate mutual funds, the growth fund and the value fund, over a period of 36 years, which goes from 1984 all the way down to 2019. This investor wishes to know several things about the fund. Which one had a higher average return, so the mean return. They want to know which fund had a greater variation. We can find that through a whole bunch of different things. We can take the minimum return and the maximum return, see how big that spread is. Or we can take the first quartile and the third quartile and figure out what the interquartile range is. After we get done with all those calculations, we're asked to identify any outliers, which is a good thing we're finding the interquartile range because we can use that with the formulas from this chapter to figure out what our limits are for outliers. What's the lowest number we can have that's not an outlier? What's the highest number that we can have that's not an outlier? After we get done with all of this information, we want to conditionally format the information that we have in columns B and C over here and construct a box and whisker plot for all of the information. So let's get started here. For the minimum return, for both the growth and the value fund, the function that we can use is the min function. So I'll go to insert function, type in min, hit OK, and it'll pop up. And all we need to do is highlight the range of cells we want to find the minimum of. That's everything in column B. So I'm going to click cell B2, Control Shift down to highlight all of column B and hit OK. And we see that the lowest return, the worst year that the growth fund had, was a loss of 40.9%. We can do the same thing over here in cell G9 to find the minimum of the value fund. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use the min function. I'm going to highlight all of the numbers in column C, C2 to C37. I'm going to hit OK. And I see that the worst year the value fund had was 46.52% loss, which is very ugly here. Moving on to our quartiles. I'm going to use the percentile function this time. You could use the quartile function if you wanted to. I'm going to hit go, and I want the inclusive one, so we're keeping track of the edges. I'm going to hit OK on the percentile.inc function, and it's going to ask me the array while doing it for the growth fund, so I want everything in column B, just like before. I'm going to click the first cell and then Control Shift down to highlight everything. And since this is the first quartile, I'm going to use 0.25 as my K, and get 2.86. I'm going to do the same thing over here for the value fund, percentile inc. I'm going to take the array of all the returns that we had for column C. I still want the 25th percentile because it's the first quartile, not 0.25, there we go. Hit OK. And we see that the value fund has a first quartile return of 1.7%. For the mean return, we're going to use the average function. Average function for all of the returns that we had for growth in column B comes out to be 15.76%. So that was the average return that we had on the growth fund. What about the value fund? Once again, we'll use the average function because we're looking for the mean arithmetic average of this. We want all of the numbers that we can get for column C. And I'm going to hit OK. And we find out that the average return for the value fund during this 36-year span was 12.01% for the third quartile. Let's go back and use our percentile.inc function, which we had already used. So I'm just going to click on it, hit OK. This is for the growth fund, so I want all the numbers in column B. It's the third quartile now, so I want 0.75, so 75% of the data is below it. I'm going to hit OK, and I come up with 36.97. For the value fund, using that same inclusive percentile function, percentile.inc, I hit OK. The array now is all of the numbers that we have in column C. And the K is still 0.75. And we come up with 22.44. And then for the maximum return, we can use Excel's max function. So I'm going to go to insert function. I'm going to type in max, hit go, pops up as the very first return, hit OK. And this is for the growth fund, so one more time, I want the entirety of column B's information in cells B2 to B37, and I get a max return of 79.48, which in this case is the single greatest one-year return that the growth fund has had in this 36-year range. For the value fund, let's also use the max function. This time for all the information that we had in column C. Control Shift down, bring that in, And the value fund's biggest return was 44.08. Right now, I guess we can knock out the interquartile range as well. Always Q3 minus Q1. So for the growth fund, it's equal to the third quartile return of 36.97 minus the first quartile return of 2.86. Comes out to 34.11. Over here for the value fund, it's the third quartile return of 22.44 minus the first quartile return of 1.7. Comes out to be 20.74. And now we can discuss briefly what these two funds look like. And judging from all the numbers we have right here, the growth fund has a higher mean. It has a higher average return. It had a higher maximum return, which means on average over a period of time, the growth fund will have a better opportunity to return a greater amount of investment. It has shown that it has the greater opportunity for the maximum profit investment, and even both of the quartiles are higher. But what else it has is also a higher range, interquartile range. And even here, looking at these numbers, we can see the spread between the max return and the min return is also greater for the growth fund than it is for the value fund. So you have a higher overall average, but since you have a higher amount of variance in there, it looks like the growth fund has the higher potential for earnings, but also the higher potential for loss, which is kind of weird right here because the value fund on that trend actually has the single worst year out of both of these funds in the year that it lost 46.52%. I'm willing to bet that that number is going to be an outlier for the value fund because just even looking through the list of numbers that I can see right here, there's nothing else that's even close to that. But let's make sure that that is correct. Let's quantify it in numbers by finding our limits. So the lower outlier limit is equal to the first quartile, which for the growth one was 2.86, minus 1.5 times our interquartile range, which for this fund is 34.11, and it comes out to 48.31. That is our lower outlier limit. What about for the value fund? Let's use the same formula. Q1, so the return was 1.7 here, minus 1.5 times the interquartile range for the value fund of 20.74, and we come out to 29.40. And here we've got validation for saying that that's an outlier. We're saying for the value fund, according to that calculation that we just did, anything worse than a 29.4% loss should be considered an outlier, and that is definitely a worse loss. As we can see right here, even though growth's semi-close, it doesn't meet its outlier bounds, which just justifies the thought process we had earlier, that the growth fund has greater potential, but it's also more volatile. What about the upper outlier limits? Well, we're going to find that formula with Q3, which for the growth fund is 36.97, plus 1.5 times the interquartile range, which is 34.11. Comes out to be 88.14. Since the highest return is 79.48, we don't have any outliers in the growth fund on the high side. What about for the value fund? Well, third quartile is 22.44 plus 1.5 times the interquartile range of 20.74, and that comes out to be 53.54. Again, the max return that we experienced during the period on the value fund is not higher than that number, so there are no upper outliers for the value fund as well. We're asked here to conditionally format to detect outliers, just to make sure that everything is working out. We can do that in Excel by going to conditional formatting. What we're going to want to do here is we're going to go down and we're going to hit new rule, and we're going to make a rule where it's going to change the color of the cell if it indeed ends up being an outlier. So our first rule that we want to put in is going to use a formula. We want to use a formula to determine which cells to format. Well, what I want is to check if all of the numbers in column B are going to be outliers. As you can see here, there's these little dollar signs before the B and before the 2. What that is it's an absolute reference, and in this case, it'll always reference that cell, even if I move things around. We'll get more into this later this semester, but to make this work much easier and faster, what you're going to want to do is get rid of that dollar sign between the B and the 2. That way it locks in column B and you're always checking column B, but the actual number of the cell going down will change. With that in mind, now that we're going to be checking all of the numbers in column B to see if they are a low outlier, we're going to be checking to see if all of those numbers are less than our lower limit, which for this particular fund, the growth fund, was 48.31%. And we always want to reference that one number, no moving it around, so leave both of the dollar signs in there. For format, it's what we want it to do if this condition over here is met. So I'm going to hit format. And you have all these options. You can change the font of it. You can change the styling of it. You can put a border around it. The easiest one for me, though, is to go to fill and pick a color. And I'm just going to pick this red color right here. And I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to hit OK here. And in this cell right here, nothing changed. And it shouldn't, because the way that we set that in says to change the cell to red if it proves to be an outlier. And 1984's loss of 5.5% is not within our outlier range. It's not lower than the 48.31% loss lower outlier threshold. Now what I want to do to apply that same concept to all of the cells in column B is I want to click on the one that I just formatted, column cell B2. I'm going to hit Format Painter up here on the Home tab, top left corner, and I'm going to highlight the rest of the cells in column B. And when I did that, nothing happens. Now, why would that be? It's because the growth fund doesn't have a lower outlier. We already know that. The minimum return of 40.9% is not an outlier because it's not lower than the 48.31% bound. So we formatted that column, the entirety of B, to detect outliers. There isn't any, so there's nothing to detect. Let's have it do the same thing this time for upper level outliers, things that would be above the highest upper outlier limit. So back to conditional formatting, we want another new rule. And we want to use a formula to determine if we need to format cells by having it click into this row right here, find that the number reported in B doesn't exceed the upper outlier limit. Just like we did before, get rid of that dollar sign between the B and the 2 so we can conditionally format. Perfect. And then this is the upper outlier, so it would only be an outlier if that number was greater than the upper limit. And the upper limit is 88.14% for that growth fund. For the same thing for format, I just want to change it to a red cell if that is the case. Hit OK. Hit OK here. Obviously, this negative 5.5% return is not going to trigger as an upper level outlier because it's nowhere near the 88.14% max. Let's apply that concept all the way down this column. So I'm going to click onto the first number we have in B2 that we just formatted, click the Format Painter, and then I'm going to highlight the rest of column B. And again, nothing is going to change here because none of the numbers that are in that cell are greater than our outlier limit. The max was 79.48%, not above 88.14%. Let's do the same thing over here for the value fund. We want to go over here and we want to conditionally format a new rule. So I'm going to put a new rule into cell C2 this time. And our new rule here is going to be based upon a formula. And that formula in the bottom part right here is that the number that we have in column C, delete the second dollar sign one more time, is less than the lower bound. 29.4% was our lower outlier limit. And if that's the case, we want it to turn red. So click the Format button, click the red cell, and it should be looking like this. And once we're done, we can hit OK. 8.59 didn't change because it's not below the lower outlier limit of negative 29.4. But what happens when we conditionally format the whole entire column? Click in cell C2, hit the Format Painter, and highlight every other number that we have in that cell. And when we do, boom, look at that. In 2008, our loss of 46.52% just turned red all on its own. And we know that that was our outlier already because that minimum return was lower than the lower limit. And it was the only one that we have in this whole entire column that's below that 29.4% loss, which means our conditional formatting is working. Just to be thorough, let's put in one last rule for the upper outlier. So we're going to go to conditional formatting. We're going to go to new rules. We're going to use a formula to determine which cells to format. I want the information column C again, clicking in there, deleting out the second dollar sign. And for this, we were checking for upper outliers, so we want it to be greater than the limit. Anything that's greater than that number will be formatted as red. So we hit OK here. We hit OK on the thing, and we come up with Nothing there because that 8.59% doesn't exceed the upper boundary. Use the format pater and format all of the rest of the cells with those same formulas. And nothing triggered right here because we don't have any upper outliers. The max return of 44.08 isn't greater than 53.54. So we're almost done with this problem. We've gone through, we've assessed for what's the mean average return. We used the minimum and maximum returns, the quartiles to figure out what the variance is between the two. And we also checked for outliers and determined that there is one for the value fund. So while the worst year of either of the funds was for the value fund, all in all, it's still pretty true that the range is safer on the value fund, that most times you're going to have a lesser return than you would overall. And then we get to do the last part of this, and we're going to construct a box and whisker plot. To make a box and whisker plot, all we have to do is highlight all the information that we want to use as the box and whisker. I want to make sure I have the titles in here as well, so I'm going to click on growth and value, highlighting cells B1 and C1 at the same time. And then once I have those, Control Shift down, highlight the whole entirety of the information. And I'm going to use this to insert, so I'm going to click Insert on the top, a statistical chart, which you can find in the middle right here. It's the one with the little bars next to it, the histogram, if you're familiar with what that is. We're going to hit the drop down here, and what we want is we want a box and whisker. And when I put the box and whisker in, it looks a little something like this, and it's our summary up top. We have the median in the middle, the first quartile, the third quartile, the max, and the min for both of our two different funds. So the information's in there. Let's just pretty this chart up really fast. I want to add a couple of elements here, so I'm going to hit the plus button in the corner to add some chart elements, and I want axis titles and I want a legend. And when I put both of those in, axis titles, there we go, I can change some things around. Firstly, this one down here is the series number. We don't want that. It's not doing us any good. So click on it until it's highlighted, hit delete, and it'll go away. We can change our axis titles, our y-axis and our x-axis, to what they represent. Well, what are all these numbers over here? They're the percentage of return that we had on the funds. So I'm going to go in here, use a combination of the backspace button, delete button, whatever I need to get them all out of there, and type in rate of return. And just for the sake of clarity to the users of this chart, I'm going to put percentage in parentheses so they know these numbers are not, a 20x return, they're a 20% return. For the bottom axis title, what are these two things? They're the two different types of mutual funds that we had. So I can just highlight all that information, get that out of there, and we're going to call that fund type. And we'll change the chart title to what the chart is. This is a mutual fund returns box plot. And that by itself is fine. I'm going to change two things in here personally that I think make the chart look better. Firstly, if I click on the little legend that we have here for growth and value, and I right click it, it'll say format legend. And you'll get all of these options on the side, and the option I want is the position, which is already here. I want to move this guy to the bottom. So I'm going to click bottom, and it'll move those keys down to the bottom. Just it's not covering up the chart now. Like we read top to bottom, so now we see the returns, and we've got this, and it seems clear to me. The other thing that I don't like is our axis over here goes all the way to 100, but we don't have a number that's even bigger than 80. So we got space in our chart that's really not doing us a whole lot of good. I can change that by clicking on the series of numbers that we have over here, right-clicking, clicking Format Axis, and when I do that, over here it gives us our bounds, and that's basically the range that we want this axis to go between. We got to keep the bottom at -60 because we have that variable return over here for value, and if we only went to -40, we'd be cutting off that little outlier that's marked by the dot over there. But since we have nothing above 80, I'm going to set the maximum to 80. And enter, and when I do, my chart is going to fill out, and now I got rid of the top end of this. The 80 to 100 is gone. It's just filling up more space. It makes it easier to read, and if you're making information for somebody, this makes a good data visualization. You can be talking about how the growth fund has a higher average return has a greater thing for return, but also experiences more variance, and it's displayed right here with each fund's box and whisker.